إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد. I greet you all with the Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I feel quite humbled. I feel very humbled. First and foremost, I was invited by Manchester University ISOC to participate in today's debate on God, delusion or truth. I also would like to thank Guy Otten for his participation also, and most significantly and most importantly, the main participants, which are yourselves, the audience. But I feel even more humbled because of the Qur'an. The beautiful recitation of the Qur'an resonates in one's soul so deeply that it transcends any form of logical deduction, rational deduction, or any type of philosophy. This is the phenomena of the Qur'an. This is why I feel very humble. And the Qur'an does this to somebody, to the listener, to the sincere listener that doesn't have any emotional baggage or intellectual baggage or any assumptions, but allows his fitrah, his innate essence, to be free so he can engage with the Qur'an. One may argue, well, the Qur'an then doesn't engage with your intellectual capacities. Well, it does. The Qur'an, the book of the Muslims, that they believe is a book directly revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God exalted is He. This book seeks to impose itself on everyone in this room. Brother, sister and friend. This book seeks to impose itself. Yes, indeed. But this imposition is not a negative one. It is a positive one, because it seeks to tease and engage the emotional and intellectual capacities of the human being. It seeks to engage with the aqliyah, in Arabic meaning the intellect, the nafsiyah, in Arabic meaning your psychological disposition, your essence. So the Qur'an does this. And how does one seek to engage with one's emotional and intellectual capacities? Well, it does so by asking questions. أَوَلَمْ يَتَفَكَّرُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. Do they not reflect within themselves? And the Qur'an goes even further than this. It has a unique psycho-linguistic strategy, if you like. Every time it talks about the oneness of Allah, Tawheed, the oneness of God. Every time it talks about the orbits, the stars, the natural phenomena, it ends with the following strategy. For those who know, for those who use their minds, for those who reflect. كَذَلِكَ نُفَصِّلُ الْآيَاتِ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. Thus do we explain our signs, our proofs, our evidences for those who reflect. Yatafakkarun here is very deep. It's not being a desert romantic and just staring at the stars and feeling the sand. It's deeper than this. It has connotations of the thing that you're reflecting upon. You must inquire about its implication. This is the effect of the Qur'an. This is the effect of its message. And in this light, we should proceed to debate. I'm going to be talking about two evidences that I believe substantiate the belief in the existence of God. My case today will show and hopefully prove that there are greater reasons to believe that a God exists rather than God does not exist. And these arguments are as follows. The first one is a reasoning argument. Some may call this argument the cosmological argument. The second argument, which I believe is even more fascinating, is the argument that the Qur'an is a miracle. You cannot find a naturalistic explanation to explain the authorship of the Qur'an, therefore there's only a supernatural explanation. And what I mean by the supernatural, the divine, is a transcendental being which most theists have a consensus on. But before I engage deeply into this discussion, I like to first and foremost deal with some emotional arguments. Because I believe if someone is a humanist, or if someone is an atheist, or if someone is an agnostic, it's because they are in denial of the divine. Not because they don't have evidence for the divine, they are in denial of the divine for the following emotional reasons. And we must transcend emotional hype and rhetoric and generalizations and sweeping statements. These are the following emotional arguments. 1. God is not necessary. Well, to counter that, George Bush is not really necessary in my life. It doesn't mean he doesn't exist. It's an emotional argument. 2. God is irrelevant. Well, surely for a 4-year-old, the existence of the state of China is also irrelevant. It doesn't mean China does not exist. 3. What God? There's too many to choose. Well, having plenty of choice doesn't negate the existence of God. I may do some investigation about who my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was, and I'll end up in a village in Greece called Ravani, and I might have a choice of 4 really old guys who have similar names. It doesn't mean I never had a granddad, or great-great-great-great-granddad. 4. There is no physical evidence, therefore it doesn't exist. Well, I would argue, no one carries the philosophy of hardcore empiricism. Everything is real and truth just because you could analyze it, put it into a laboratory. This is hardcore empirical outlook to any form of investigation. Because empiricism, or requiring physical evidence for everything, is quite fallacious. Because you can never answer the following question. Do you have a great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother? She has no grave. You can't assess if she's physically here. The only way to substantiate you had a great-great-great-great-great-grandmother is by rational evidence. Because you would not be here today if you never had a great-great-great-great and so on grandmother. 5. The problem of evil. God's supposed to be good, but there's too much evil in the world. God has the power to stop good, therefore God doesn't exist, or the good God doesn't exist. This is another fallacious argument because this is logically posterior to the existence of God. What this basically means is that God's existence has nothing to do with his character, his essence. The debate today if a God or a transcendental being that caused the universe exists. That's one argument. Now you have to believe that he exists, whether to assess if he's good or bad, and how we can assess that. So the problem of evil is logically posterior. It's after the existence of God, which has nothing to do with today's debate. And then someone may pose another argument, which is the 6th argument, evolution. Well, evolution doesn't even have its foot in the door. We're talking about the cause of the whole universe, rather than the very macrocosm, if you like, from a philosophical perspective of the development of different species. So hopefully, we've brushed those emotional and fallacious arguments aside. Now to my main argument. The reason argument, or the cosmological argument. We have all asked where we are from, what we are doing here, and why we are here. We also have asked, and typically many philosophers from day one have asked, why does something exist instead of nothing? Well, typically the atheist outlook is as follows. 1. The universe is just eternal and uncaused, or the universe is caused, but it's caused by something mechanical, or a pre-existing set of conditions. And I'm going to attempt to show how that there is a sole cause with a personality that created the universe. Now, let's take the eternal argument. If the universe was eternal, had no beginning, has no end, is just eternal, timeless, then surely this means that our past is also eternal. Our past is infinite. But I would pose the question, can infinite actually exist in the real world? Well, let's take David Hilbert, the famous mathematician. What did he have to say about the infinite into the real world? He says, the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature, nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains of the infinite to play is solely that of an idea. Even the famous philosopher Immanuel Kant, he said, it thus follows that it is impossible for an infinite world series to have passed away. So I would argue, if the universe was eternal, then surely we must have an infinite past. But infinity cannot exist in the real world. So we must have a cause. Let me give you an example. I call it the Manchester University Library example. Say we're in Manchester University and we wanted to borrow the book called the Qur'an, the book of the Muslims. If there were 4 people in front of you, you have to wait 4 people on. If there were 400 people in front of you, you would have to wait 400 people on. But what if there was an infinite or forever amount of people in front of you? Would you ever get the book? No. Similarly, we cannot have an infinite set of past events. Therefore, rational necessity dictates there must have been a cause for the universe. That's one point. There is a cause. Secondly, what is the nature of this cause? Now, I would argue that the nature of this cause must be timeless. As Stephen Hawking said, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning. Also, this cause must be uncaused, because we've already established that if there's an infinite amount of causes, we will never have the effect today. Thirdly, this cause must be immaterial, which means beyond creation, because rational necessity dictates that this being created matter and creation as we know it. And most importantly, which is a response and a refutation of some of the atheists who claim there is a cause but it's mechanical, most importantly, this cause must have a will. Must will things to come into play or come into existence, which indicates a personality. The way we understand that things have a personality, if things generally have a will. And I would argue this cause has a will, indicating it's a personal agent. Because how could a timeless being bring into an effect that is finite? Because if it was just mechanical or a pre-existing set of conditions, the cause could not exist without the effect. But we've already established that the effect here is finite and the cause is timeless. So you must have willed the effect to come into play. For example, if you had 100 degrees for eternity past, there'll be boiling water also for eternity past. A pre-existing condition cannot exist without its effect if it's just a pre-existing condition or something mechanical. Therefore, it must have a will. Now, I would argue this is also supported by astrophysical evidence. Everyone has heard of the Big Bang. For example, according to the 4 prominent scientists, J. Richard, James Gunn, David Schramm, and Beatrice Tinley, describe the event of the Big Bang as follows. The universe began to exist from a state of infinite density, and time were created in that event, and so was all the matter in the universe. But in scientific language, infinite density, in normal layman terms, actually means nothing. For example, Cambridge astronomer Fred Hoyle, he states that the universe, at a point in time, shrunk down to nothing at all. So the Big Bang model requires us to believe that the universe was created out of nothing. But I would argue, brothers, sisters, and friends, that out of nothing, nothing comes. Even Anthony Kenny, a professor at Oxford University, he says, a proponent of the Big Bang theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came out of nothing and by nothing. So I repeat, out of nothing, nothing comes. And this resonates in the following statement of P.J. Swart in his publication About Time, when he said, if there is anything we find inconceivable, is that something could arise from nothing. And the eminent physicist Sir Arthur Eddington also states, the beginning seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look on it as frankly supernatural. So to summarize the argument, 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore the universe has a cause. Now let me deal with some counter-arguments. I don't want to preach to the converted here or just have some rhetoric. Let me have a bit more of a nuanced discussion. These are some some of the counter-arguments. One, things do exist, do begin to exist without a cause. And some scientists or philosophers, they state that in a vacuum, subatomic particles are formed out of nothing without any cause. However, there's a problem here. If we read John and Barrow and Frank Tipler's publication, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, we will understand the vacuum is actually not nothing. It has facilitated the occurrence of these subatomic particles, which they call, the facilitation is the fluctuation of energy. Two, our universe is actually part of many universes called the multiverse theory. This is metaphysical claim. It's a leap of faith. It has no empirical scientific evidence. So they're just pulling this claim out of thin air, and it's not substantiated by anything empirical. So it goes against even their own empirical philosophy. For example, scientist John Polkinghorne, he even resonates the same statement. He says, people try and trick out a many-universe account in a sort of pseudo-scientific terms, but that is pseudoscience, meaning fake science. It is a metaphysical guess. The other counter-argument that is posed by many atheists and agnostics or humanists is that there is an actual infinite. But there isn't. There's a confusion here. Because the topic of the infinite, or the discussion about infinite, only exists in the mathematical realm of discourse. It's a mathematical concept that exists in that reality. Calculus, etc. But it has no ontological export into the real world, which means you cannot take the infinite and make it apply into the real world. And we could read this in Abraham Robertson's, in his article in the Journal of Symbolic Logic called Mathematical Problems. And I would argue that there's a confusion between the potential infinite and the actual infinite. If I were to walk towards Guy Otten, for example, you can split the distance between myself and Guy Otten into infinite parts. But I can walk across the actual finite distance to Guy Otten. So the question is, I can actually traverse a distance of a finite distance that can be potentially split up into infinite parts. So there's a difference between the potential infinite, which is not really in actualization, and the actual infinite. For example, Kasner and Newman, in the publication Mathematics and Imagination, nicely put it. They say, the infinite certainly does not exist in the same sense that we say there are fish in the sea. Existence in the mathematical sense is wholly different from the existence of objects in the physical world. The last counter-argument, well then who created God? Well, they haven't been listening to my argument. Firstly, the argument is about not that all things exist have a cause, but all things that begin to exist have a cause. Secondly, philosophically, the best explanation doesn't require an explanation. And thirdly, I would argue God cannot have a cause, because that would not make him God anymore. And also, God cannot have a cause, because that would mean we're back to the absurdity of an infinite set of past events or an infinite set of causes, which we have already discussed cannot happen. So there must be a sole uncaused cause. So this is the summary, and this is the description of the first argument. The second argument, which is a supportive argument, but I think it's very strong, is the Qur'an itself is a miracle and can only be explained supernaturally, i.e. via the divine, via transcendental being. The Qur'an in Surah Baqarah verse 23 says, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِّمَّا نَزَلْنَا عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِّثْلِهِ وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. And if you are in doubt, talking to the whole of humanity here, if you are in doubt about that which we have sent to our servant, referring to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, peace and blessings be upon him, then bring one chapter like it, which is 3 lines long, and call on your witnesses and supporters and helpers besides God, besides Allah, if you are truthful. Now, according to the consensus opinion amongst Western and Eastern scholarship including Ibn Kathir, Jalalain, and Ibn Abbas, the companion of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, this verse has something to do with the special, unique, structural nature of the language of the Qur'an. And this comes as a historical context. Because we know the revelation of the Qur'an 1400 years ago was set in a linguistic context. Because the Arabs at that time were Arab linguists par excellence. They were best at expressing themselves in the Arabic language. For example, Ibn Rashid, he illustrates the importance attached to language at that time. He says, whenever a poet emerged in an Arab tribe, other tribes would come to congratulate, feasts would be prepared, the women would join together on lutes as they do at weddings, and old and young men would all rejoice at the good news. The Arabs used to congratulate other people only on the birth of a child and when a poet rose among them. Now, I want to entertain this in the question and answers, but the assumption is that the Qur'an has a unique structural feature, not its aesthetic reception. I'm not talking about Shakespeare here. Shakespeare was very nice, Romeo and Juliet, beautiful. But that's not the point. His language may have been unique from an aesthetic reception point of view, but his language sat in the iambic pentameter, which was replicated by many English scholars such as Christopher Marlowe, etc. But with the Qur'an, the structural features of the text are unknown. So keep that in mind. For example, Professor Bruce Lawrence says in his book, The Qur'an, A Biography, he says, Quranic verses are expressive of an inexhaustible truth. They signify meaning layered within meaning, light upon light, miracle after miracle. Martin Zamet, another Orientalist from the Netherlands, he says, the Qur'an is the most eminent written manifestation of the Arabic language. Arthur J. Arbery, a famous translator and Arabist, he says, the Qur'an is in the prose, no poetry. We have an ijma'a in Arabic, a consensus amongst differing types of scholarship that point to my conclusion that the Qur'an has unique structural features. And these features include the unique literary form, the unique linguistic genre, its peak of eloquence, and an abundance of rhetorical features, which we can discuss in the Q&A. But how does this make it a miracle? Now, I do not believe in miracles, and the general modern-day contemporary consensus on a miracle is unlike the old ironclad perspective, which was basically things that go beyond natural law. This is not a miracle. Because natural law are just patterns that you perceive in the universe. Now, if something goes against that pattern, then surely it could have been part of the pattern, maybe an exception. But a miracle, according to modern-day philosophers like the philosopher Lane Craig, he says a miracle are acts of impossibilities. And he puts in the following words: events that lie outside the productive capacity of nature. Let me use the Qur'an to show that the Qur'an is a miracle, according to this description. We have the Qur'an as an event. Its uniqueness is related to language. The nature of this event is the Arabic language. When we go to the Arabic language and we exhaust all possibilities to try and emulate the structural features of the Qur'an, when we exhaust, keep this in mind, exhaust all the possibilities of the finite, not infinite, finite words, 28 letters, the grammatical rules, we cannot emulate the structural features of the Qur'an. But it's still related to this nature. So what the Qur'an does, it descopes the Arabic language. And there's no naturalistic explanation to explain the Qur'an, because when we go to the nature of the event, which is the unique language, and we exhaust all the possibilities, we can't still create Qur'an. So the Qur'an is an event that lies outside the productive capacity of the nature of the Arabic language. It's equivalent of me getting this bottle, plastic bottle, H2O, which is water for those scientifically illiterate among you, and you close it, you give it a good shake, and then you create Gai'otan. Now this is an impossibility, you would argue, but you've seen it happen. So this is the nature and this is the event. But we cannot find a naturalistic explanation because it's just plastic and it's water. How can it create Gai'otan? So this is the case with the Qur'an. It's a miracle because when we go to the nature of its event, which is the uniqueness of the structural features of the language, and we exhaust all possibilities, we are grasping at intellectual straws and we say, surely we cannot find any naturalistic explanation because we can't argue there's going to be another word of the Arabic language or another grammatical rule or another letter of the Arabic language, because that would allow us to say, fine, let me wait a bit longer, do more possibilities. But that's not the case here, because we have a finite set of tools in order to try and establish the structural feature of the Qur'an. But we can't. So logically it follows that the Qur'an is a miracle. If the Qur'an is a miracle, it's done by a supernatural entity, and that is best described as a transcendental being, which we call God, and Muslims call Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let me conclude this part. This is supported by Western scholarship. The highly acclaimed professor and Arabist Hamilton Gibb, he states, the Meccans still demanded of him a miracle, and with remarkable boldness and self-confidence, Muhammad appealed as a supreme confirmation of his mission to the Qur'an itself. Like all Arabs, they were connoisseurs of the language and rhetoric. Well, then if the Qur'an was his own composition, other men can rival it. Let them produce 10 verses like it, and if they could not, and he says, and it is obvious that they could not, then let them accept the Qur'an as an outstanding evidential miracle. Paul Casanova, in April 1909 at the College of France, he states, whenever Muhammad was asked a miracle as a proof of the authenticity of his mission, he quoted the composition of the Qur'an as its incomparable excellence as proof of its divine origin. The Reverend R. Bosworth Smith, he concludes in his book, Mohammedanism, that the Qur'an is a miracle of purity of style, of wisdom and of truth. It is one miracle claimed by Muhammad, his standing miracle, and a miracle indeed it is. Now, my arguments today that I am posing as a cogent case for the existence of a God, to show that there are greater reasons to believe in the divine, I believe can only be refuted if Mr. Otten addresses my premises. I don't want an emotional argument about who God is and why He's evil. Let's have the discussion when we believe that He exists. Let's have a frank discussion. There's no more time for statements of Christopher Hitchens and Mr. Richard Dawkins, which amongst the academic communities they're seen as pseudo-intellectual, which I'm Greek, and pseudo means fake intellectuals. For example, Dawkins states, if people think God is interesting, then the onus is on them to show that there is anything there to talk about. Otherwise, they should just shut up about it. This is high arrogance. Christopher Hitchens, when he's commenting on people claiming that God exists, he says, what can be asserted without proof can be dismissed without proof. So it's time to transcend this type of egoism and arrogance and have a nuanced discussion. And Guy Otten must address my premises, which are as follows. 1. He will have to show that there can be an infinite set of past events, i.e., infinity is a reality and has a basis in the real world. 2. He must show that things which begin to exist have no cause, using evidence. 3. The Qur'an can be imitated. 4. And the language of the Qur'an can be explained naturalistically. I wish him the best of luck. And as the Americans say, Godspeed. I'd like to end that anything that I've said that's offensive, wrong, and inaccurate has come from my nafs, which in the Arabic language means your ego. And anything I've said that's good, unquestionably indeed, has come from God Himself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'll have to end, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Unquestionably, indeed, all praise is due to God. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, exalted is He. Jazakallah here. Thank you very much for listening.